Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Derelict by William Hope Hodgson. The Red Magazine, December 1912. It's the material, said the old ship's doctor. The material plus the conditions. And maybe, he added slowly, a third factor. Yes, a third factor, but there. He broke off his half-meditative sentence and began to charge his pipe. Go on, doctor, we said encouragingly, and with more than a little expectancy. We were in the smoke-room of the Sand, running across the North Atlantic, and the doctor was a character. He concluded the charging of his pipe and lit it, then settled himself and began to express himself more fully. The material, he said with conviction, is inevitably the medium of expression of the life force, the fulcrum, as it were, lacking which it is unable to exert itself, or indeed, to express itself in any form or fashion that would be intelligible or evident to us. So potent is the share of the material in the production of that thing which we name life, and so eager the life force to express itself, that I am convinced it would, if given the right conditions, make itself manifest even through so hopeless seeming a medium as a simple block of sawn wood. For I tell you, gentlemen, the life force is both as fiercely urgent and as indiscriminate as fire, the destructor, yet which some are now growing to consider the very essence of life rampant. There is a quaint seeming paradox there, he concluded, nodding his old grey head. Yes, doctor, I said. In brief, your argument is that life is a thing, state, fact, or element, call it what you like, which requires the material through which to manifest itself, and that given the material plus the conditions, the result is life. In other words, that life is an evolved product, manifested through matter and bred of conditions, eh? As we understand the word, said the old doctor, though, mind you, there may be a third factor. But, in my heart, I believe that it is a matter of chemistry, conditions, and a suitable medium, but given the conditions, the brute is so almighty that it will seize upon anything through which to manifest itself. It is a force generated by conditions, but, nevertheless, this does not bring us one iota nearer to its explanation, any more than to the explanation of electricity or fire. They are, all three, of the outer forces, monsters of the void. Nothing we can do will create any one of them. Our power is merely to be able, by providing the conditions, to make each one of them manifest to our physical senses. Am I clear? Yes, doctor. In a way you are, I said. But I don't agree with you, though I think I understand you. Electricity and fire are both what I might call natural things, but life is an abstract something, a kind of all-permeating wakefulness. Oh, I can't explain it. Who could? But it's spiritual, not just a thing bred out of a condition, like fire, as you say, or electricity. It's a horrible thought of yours. Life's a kind of spiritual mystery. Easy, my boy, said the old doctor, laughing gently to himself. Or else I may be asking you to demonstrate the spiritual mystery of life of the limpet, or the crab, shall we say. He grinned at me with ineffable perverseness. Anyway, he continued, as I suppose you've all guessed, I've a yarn to tell you in support of my impression that life is no more a mystery or a miracle than fire or electricity. But please to remember, gentlemen, that because we've succeeded in naming and making good use of these two forces, they're just as much mysteries, fundamentally, as ever. And, anyway, the thing I'm going to tell you won't explain the mystery of life, but only give you one of my pegs on which I hang my feeling that life is, as I have said, a force made manifest through conditions. That is to say, natural chemistry, and that it can take for its purpose and need the most incredible and unlikely matter, for without matter it cannot come into existence, it cannot become manifest. I don't agree with you, Doctor, I interrupted. Your theory would destroy all belief in life after death. It would. Hush, Sonny, said the old man, with a quiet little smile of comprehension. Hark to what I've to say first, and anyway, what objection have you to material life after death? And if you object to a material framework, I would still have you remember that I am speaking of life, as we understand the word in this our life. Now do be a quiet lad, or I'll never be done. It was when I was a young man, and that is a good many years ago, gentlemen. I had passed my examinations, but was so run down with overwork that it was decided that I had better take a trip to sea. I was by no means well off, and very glad in the end to secure a nominal post as doctor in the sailing passenger clipper running out to China. The name of the ship was the Biosps, and soon after I had got all my gear aboard she cast off, and we dropped down the Thames, and next day were well away out in the Channel. The captain's name was Gannington, a very decent man, though quite illiterate. The first mate, Mr. Burleys, was a quiet, sternish, reserved man, very well read. The second mate, Mr. Selvin, was, perhaps by birth and upbringing, the most socially cultured of the three, but he lacked the stamina and indomitable pluck of the two others. He was more of a sensitive, and emotionally and even mentally the most alert man of the three. On our way out, we called at Madagascar, where we landed some of our passengers. Then we ran eastward, meaning to call at Northwest Cape, but about 100 degrees east we encountered very dreadful weather, which carried away all our sails and sprung the jibboom and fore-gallant mast. The storm carried us northward for several hundred miles, and when it dropped us finally, we found ourselves in a very bad state. The ship had been strained and had taken some 3 feet of water through her seams. The maintopmast had been sprung. In addition to the jibboom and fore-gallant mast, 2 of our boats had gone, as also one of the pigsties. With 3 fine pigs, these latter having been washed overboard but some half hour before the wind began to ease, which it did very quickly, though a very ugly sea ran for some hours after. The wind left us just before dark, and when morning came, it brought splendid weather, a calm, mildly undulating sea, and a brilliant sun with no wind. It showed us also that we were not alone, for about 2 miles away to the westward was another vessel, which Mr. Selvin, the second mate, pointed out to me. "That's a pretty rum-looking packet, Doctor," he said, and handed me his glass. I looked through it at the other vessel and saw what he meant, at least. I thought I did. "Yes, Mr. Selvin," I said. "She's got a pretty old-fashioned look about her." He laughed at me in his pleasant way. "It's easy to see you're not a sailor, Doctor," he remarked. "There's a dozen rum things about her. She's a derelict, and has been floating round by the look of her for many a score of years. Look at the shape of her counter, and the bows and cutwater. She's as old as the hills, as you might say, and ought to have gone down to Davy Jones a good while ago. Look at the growths on her, and the thickness of her standing rigging. That's all salt incrustations, I fancy, if you notice the white colour. She's been a small bark, but don't you see she's not a yard left aloft? They've all dropped out of the slings, everything rotted away. Wonder the standing rigging hasn't gone too. I wish the old man would let us take the boat and have a look at her. She'd be well worth it." There seemed little chance, however, of this, for all hands were turned to and kept hard at it all day long, repairing the damage to the masts and gear, and this took a long while, as you may think. Part of the time I gave a hand heaving on one of the deck capstans, for the exercise was good for my liver. Old Captain Gannington approved, and I persuaded him to come along and try some of the same medicine, which he did, and we got very chummy over the job. We got talking about the derelict, and he remarked how lucky we were not to have run full tilt onto her in the darkness, for she lay right away to leeward of us according. to the way that we had been drifting in the storm. He also was of the opinion that she had a strange look about her, and that she was pretty old. But on this latter point, he plainly had far less knowledge than the second mate, for he was, as I have said, an illiterate man, and knew nothing of seacraft beyond what experience had taught him. He lacked the book knowledge which the second mate had of vessels previous to his day, which it appeared the Derelict was. "She's an old doctor," was the extent of observations in this direction. Yet, when I mentioned to him that it would be interesting to go aboard and give her a bit of an overhaul, he nodded his head as if the idea had been already in his mind and accorded with his own inclinations. "When the work's over, Doctor," he said. "Can't spare the men now, you know. Got to get all shipshape and ready as smart as we can. But we'll take my gig and go off in the second dog watch. The glass is steady, and it'll be a bit of gam for us." That evening, after tea, the captain gave orders to clear the gig and get her overboard. The second mate was to come with us, and the skipper gave him word to see that 2 or 3 lamps were put into the boat, as it would soon fall dark. A little later we were pulling across the calmness of the sea with a crew of 6 at the oars, and making very good speed of it. "Now, gentlemen, I have detailed to you with great exactness all the facts, both big and little, so that you can follow step by step each incident in this extraordinary affair, and I want you now to pay the closest attention. I was sitting in the stern sheets with the second mate and the captain, who was steering, and as we drew nearer and nearer to the stranger, I studied her with an ever-growing attention, as indeed did Captain Gannington and the second mate. She was, as you know, to the westward of us, and the sunset was making a great flame of red light to the back of her, so that she showed a little blurred and indistinct by reason of the halation of the light, which almost defeated the eye in any attempt to see her rotting spars and standing rigging, submerged as they were in the fiery glory of the sunset. It was because of this effect of the sunset that we had come quite close, comparatively, to the Derelict before we saw that she was all surrounded by a sort of curious scum, the colour of which was difficult to decide upon by reason of the red light that was in the atmosphere, but which afterwards we discovered to be brown. This scum spread all about the old vessel for many hundreds of yards in a huge irregular patch, a great stretch of which reached out to the eastward, upon the starboard side of the boat some score or so fathoms away. "Queer stuff," said Captain Gannington, leaning to the side and looking over. "Something in the cargo as has gone rotten and worked out through her seams." "Look at her bows and stern," said the second mate. "Just look at the growth on her." There were, as he said, great clumpings of strange-looking sea fungi under the bows and the short counter astern. From the stump of her jibboom and her cutwater great beards of rime and marine growths hung downward into the scum that held her in. Her blank starboard side was presented to us, all a dead, dirtyish white, streaked and mottled vaguely with dull masses of heavier colour. "There's a steam or haze rising off her," said the second mate, speaking again. "You can see it against the light. It keeps coming and going. Look!" I saw then what he meant, a faint haze or steam, either suspended above the old vessel or rising from her. And Captain Gannington saw it also. "Spontaneous combustion," he exclaimed. "We'll have to watch when we lift the hatches, unless it's some poor devil that's got aboard of her, but that ain't likely." We were now within a couple of 100 yards of the old Derelict, and had entered into the brown scum. As it poured off the lifted oars, I heard one of the men mutter to himself, "Damn treacle!" And indeed it was not something unlike it. As the boat continued to forge nearer and nearer to the old ship, the scum grew thicker and thicker, so that, at last, it perceptibly slowed us. "Give way, lads! Put some beef to it!" sang out Captain Gannington, and thereafter there was no sound except the panting of the men and the faint, reiterated suck of the sullen brown scum upon the oars as the boat was forced ahead. As we went, I was conscious of a peculiar smell in the evening air, and whilst I had no doubt that the puddling of the scum by the oars made it rise, I could give no name to it, yet, in a way, it was vaguely familiar. We were now very close to the old vessel, and presently she was high about us against the dying light. The captain called out then to "In with the bow oars and stand by with the boat hook," which was done. "Aboard there! Ahoy! Aboard there! Ahoy!" shouted Captain Gannington, but there came no answer, only the dull sound, his voice going lost into the open sea each time he sung out. "Ahoy! Aboard there! Ahoy!" he shouted time after time, but there was only the weary silence of the old hulk that answered us. And, somehow, as he shouted, the while that I stared up half expectantly at her, a queer little sense of oppression that amounted almost to nervousness came upon me. It passed, but I remember how I was suddenly aware that it was growing dark. Darkness comes fairly rapidly in the tropics, though not so quickly as many fiction writers seem to think. But it was not that the coming dusk had perceptibly deepened in that brief time of only a few moments, but rather that my nerves had made me suddenly a little hypersensitive. I mention my state particularly, for I am not a nervy man normally, and my abrupt touch of nerves is significant in the light of what happened. "There's no one on board there," said Captain Gannington. "Give way, men," for the boat's crew had instinctively rested on their oars as the captain hailed the old craft. The men gave way again, and then the second mate called out excitedly, "Why, look there! There's our pigsty! See, it's got beosps painted on the end. It's drifted down here and the scum's caught it. What a blessed wonder!" It was, as he had said, our pigsty that had been washed overboard in the storm, and most extraordinary to come across it there. "We'll tow it off with us when we go," said the captain, and shouted to the crew to get down to their oars. For they were hardly moving the boat, because the scum was so thick, close in around the old ship, that it literally clogged the boat from moving. I remember that it struck me, in a half-conscious sort of way, as curious that the pigsty, containing our 3 dead pigs, had managed to drift in so far unaided, whilst we could scarcely manage to force the boat in. Now that we had come right into the scum, but the thought passed from my mind, for so many things happened within the next few minutes. The men managed to bring the boat in alongside, within a couple of feet of the derelict, and the man with the boat hook hooked on. "Have ye got old there, forrard?" asked Captain Gannington. "Yes, sir," said the bowman, and as he spoke, there came a queer noise of tearing. "What's that?" asked the captain. "It's tore, sir, tore clean away," said the man, and his tone showed that he had received something of a shock. "Get a hold again, then," said Captain Gannington irritably. "You don't suppose this packet was built yesterday?" Shove the hook into the main chains the man did so gingerly, as you might say, for it seemed to me, in the growing dusk, that he put no strain onto the hook, though. Of course there was no need. You see, the boat could not go very far of herself in the stuff in which she was embedded. I remember thinking this, also as I looked up at the bulging side of the old vessel. Then I heard Captain Gannington's voice. "Lord, but she's old. And what a colour, Doctor. She don't half want paint, do she? Now then, somebody, one of them oars." An oar was passed to him, and he leant it up against the ancient, bulging side. Then he paused and called to the second mate to light a couple of the lamps, and stand by to pass them up, for darkness had settled down now upon the sea. The second mate lit 2 of the lamps, and told one of the men to light a third, and keep it handy in the boat. Then he stepped across, with a lamp in each hand, to where Captain Gannington stood by the oar against the side of the ship. "Now, my lad," said the captain to the man who had pulled stroke, "up with you, and we'll pass ye up the lamps." The man jumped to obey, caught the oar, and put his weight upon it, and as he did so, something seemed to give way a little. "Look!" cried out the second mate, and pointed, lamp in hand. "It's sunk in." This was true. The oar had made quite an indentation into the bulging, somewhat slimy side of the old vessel. "Mold, I reckon," said Captain Gannington, bending towards the derelict to look. Then to the man, "Up you go, my lad, and be smart. Don't stand there waiting at that." The man, who had paused a moment as he felt the oar give beneath his weight, began to shin up, and in a few seconds he was aboard and leant out over the rail for the lamps. These were passed up to him, and the captain called to him to steady the oar. Then Captain Gannington went, calling to me to follow, and after me the second mate. As the captain put his face over the rail, he gave a cry of astonishment. "Mould, by gum! Mould, tons of it! Good Lord!" As I heard him shout that, I scrambled the more eagerly after him, and in a moment or two I was able to see what he meant. Everywhere that the light from the two lamps struck, there was nothing but smooth great masses and surfaces of a dirty white-coloured mould. I climbed over the rail, with the second mate close behind, and stood upon the mould-covered decks. There might have been no planking beneath the mould, for all that our feet could feel. It gave under our tread with a spongy, puddingy feel. It covered the deck furniture of the old ship, so that the shape of each article and fitment was often no more than suggested through it. Captain Gannington snatched a lamp from the man, and the second mate reached for the other. They held the lamps high, and we all stared. It was most extraordinary, and somehow most abominable. I can think of no other word, gentlemen, that so much describes the predominant feeling that affected me at the moment. "Good Lord," said Captain Gannington several times. "Good Lord." But neither the second mate nor the man said anything, and for my part I just stared, and at the same time began to smell a little at the air, for there was a vague odour of something half familiar, that somehow brought to me a sense of half-known fright. I turned this way and that, staring, as I have said. Here and there the mould was so heavy as to entirely disguise what lay beneath, converting the deck fittings into indistinguishable mounds of mould, all dirty white and blotched and veined with irregular, dull, purplish markings. There was a strange thing about the mould which Captain Gannington drew attention to. It was that our feet did not crush into it and break the surface as might have been expected, but merely indented it. "Never seen nothing like it before. Never," said the captain, after having stooped with his lamp to examine the mould under our feet. He stamped with his heel, and the mould gave out a dull, puddingy sound. He stooped again with a quick movement and stared, holding the lamp close to the deck. "Blessed if it ain't a reg'lar skin to it." The second mate and the man and I all stooped and looked at it. The second mate progged it with his forefinger, and I remember I rapped it several times with my knuckles, listening to the dead sound it gave out, and noticing the close, firm texture of the mould. "Dough," the second mate. "It's just like blessed dough, poof." He stood up with a quick movement. "I could fancy it stinks a bit," he said. As he said this, I knew, suddenly, what the familiar thing was in the vague odour that hung about us. It was that the smell had something animal-like in it. Something of the same smell, only heavier, that you would smell in any place that is infested with mice. I began to look about with a sudden, very real uneasiness. There might be vast numbers of hungry rats aboard. They might prove exceedingly dangerous, if in a starving condition, yet, as you will understand, somehow I hesitated to put forward my idea as a reason for caution. It was too fanciful. Captain Gannington had begun to go aft along the mould-covered main deck with the second mate, each of them holding their lamps high up, so as to cast a good light about the vessel. I turned quickly and followed them, the man with me keeping close to my heels and plainly uneasy. As we went, I became aware that there was a feeling of moisture in the air, and I remembered the slight mist, or smoke. Above the hulk, which had made Captain Gannington suggest spontaneous combustion in explanation. And always as we went, there was that vague animal smell. Suddenly I found myself wishing we were well away from the old vessel. Abruptly, after a few paces, The captain stopped and pointed at a row of mold-hidden shapes on each side of the main deck. "Guns," he said. "Been a privateer in the old days, I guess. Maybe worse." "We'll have a look below, Doctor. There may be something worth touching. She's older than I thought. Mr. Selvin thinks she's about 200 years old, but I scarce think it." We continued our way aft, and I remember that I found myself walking as lightly and gingerly as possible, as if I were subconsciously afraid of treading through the rotten, mold-hid decks. I think the others had a touch of the same feeling from the way that they walked. Occasionally the soft stuff would grip our heels, releasing them with a little sullen suck. The captain forged somewhat ahead of the second mate, and I know that the suggestion he had made himself, that perhaps there might be something below worth carrying away, had stimulated his imagination. The second mate was, however, beginning to feel somewhat the same way that I did. At least I have that impression. I think, if it had not been for what I might truly describe as Captain Gannington's sturdy courage, we should all of us have just gone back over the side very soon. For there was most certainly an unwholesome feeling abroad that made one feel queerly lacking in pluck, and you will soon see that this feeling was justified. Just as the captain reached the few mold-covered steps leading up onto the short half-poop, I was suddenly aware that the feeling of moisture in the air had grown very much more definite. It was perceptible now, intermittently, as a sort of thin, moist, fog-like vapor that came and went oddly, and seemed to make the decks a little indistinct to the view this time and that. Once an odd puff of it beat up suddenly from somewhere and caught me in the face, carrying a queer, sickly, heavy odor with it that somehow frightened me strangely with a suggestion of awaiting and half-comprehended danger. We had followed Captain Gannington up the 3 mold-covered steps and now went slowly along the raised after-deck. By the mizzenmast, Captain Gannington paused and held his lantern near to it. "My word, mister," he said to the second mate, "it's fair thickened up with mold. Why, I'll guarantee it's close on 4 foot thick." He shone the light down to where it met the deck. "Good Lord," he said, "look at the sea lice on it." I stepped up, and it was as he had said. The sea lice were thick upon it, some of them huge, not less than the size of large beetles, and all a clear, colourless shade, like water, except where there were little spots of grey on them. "I've never seen the like of them." "'Cept on a live cod," said Captain Gannington, in an extremely puzzled voice. "My word, but they're whoppers." Then he passed on, but a few paces farther aft he stopped again and held his lamp near to the mould-hidden deck. "Lord bless me, Doctor," he called out in a low voice. "Did you ever see the like of that? Why, it's a foot long if it's a hinch." I stooped over his shoulder and saw what he meant. It was a clear, colourless creature about a foot long and about 8 inches high, with a curved back that was extraordinarily narrow. As we stared, all in a group, it gave a queer little flick and was gone. "Jumped," said the captain. "Well, if that ain't a giant of all the sea lice that ever I've seen, I guess it's jumped 20 foot clear." He straightened his back and scratched his head a moment, swinging the lantern this way and that with the other hand, and staring about us. "What are they doing aboard here?" he said. "You'll see 'em little things on fat cod and such like. I'm blowed, Doctor, if I understand." He held his lamp towards a big mound of the mould that occupied part of the after portion of the low poop deck, a little foreside of where there came a 2-foot-high break to a kind of second and loftier poop that ran away aft to the taffrail. The mound was pretty big, several feet across, and more than a yard high. Captain Gannington walked up to it. "I reckon this is the scuttle," he remarked, and gave it a heavy kick. The only result was a deep indentation into the huge whitish hump of mould, as if he had driven his foot into a mass of some doughy substance. Yet I am not altogether correct in saying that this was the only result, for a certain other thing happened. From the place made by the captain's foot, there came a sudden gush of a purplish fluid, accompanied by a peculiar smell that was, and was not, half familiar. Some of the mold-like substance had stuck to the toe of the captain's boot, and from this likewise there issued a sweat, as it were, of the same colour. "Well," said Captain Gannington in surprise, and drew back his foot to make another kick at the hump of mould. But he paused at an exclamation from the second mate. "Don't, sir," said the second mate. I glanced at him, and the light from Captain Gannington's lamp showed me that his face had a bewildered, half-frightened look, as if he were suddenly and unexpectedly half afraid of something, and as if his tongue had given away his sudden fright, without any intention on his part to speak. The captain also turned and stared at him. "Why, mister?" he asked, in a somewhat puzzled voice, through which there sounded just the vaguest hint of annoyance. "We've got to shift this muck if we're to get below." I looked at the second mate, and it seemed to me that, curiously enough, he was listening less to the captain than to some other sound. Suddenly he said in a queer voice, "Listen, everybody." Yet we heard nothing beyond the faint murmur of the men talking together in the boat alongside. "I don't hear nothing," said Captain Gannington after a short pause. "Do you, Doctor?" "No," I said. "What was it you thought you heard?" The captain, turning again to the second mate. But the second mate shook his head in a curious, almost irritable way, as if the captain's question interrupted his listening. Captain Gannington stared a moment at him, then held his lantern up and glanced about him almost uneasily. I know I felt a queer sense of strain, but the light showed nothing beyond the greyish, dirty white of the mould in all directions. "Mr. Selvin," said the captain at last, looking at him, "don't get fancying things. Get hold of your bloomin' self. Ye know ye heard nothing." "I'm quite sure I heard something, sir," said the second mate. "I seem to hear—" He broke off sharply and appeared to listen with an almost painful intensity. "What did it sound like?" I asked. "It's all right, Doctor," said Captain Gannington, laughing gently. "Ye can give him a tonic when we get back. I'm going to shift this stuff." He drew back and kicked for the second time at the ugly mass which he took to hide the companionway. The result of his kick was startling, for the whole thing wobbled sloppily, like a mound of unhealthy-looking jelly. He drew his foot out of it quickly and took a step backward, staring and holding his lamp towards it. "By gum," he said, and it was plain that he was generally startled. "The blessed thing's gone soft." The man had run back several steps from the suddenly flaccid mound, and looking horribly frightened, though of what, I am sure he had not the least idea. The second mate stood where he was and stared. For my part, I know I had a most hideous uneasiness upon me. The captain continued to hold his light towards the wobbling mound and stare. "It's gone squashy all through," he said. "There's no scuttle there. There's no bally woodwork inside that lot. Phoo! What a rum smell!" He walked round to the after side of the strange mound to see whether there might be some signs of an opening into the hull at the back of the great heap of mould stuff. And then, "Listen," said the second mate again, in the strangest sort of voice. Captain Gannington straightened himself upright, and there succeeded a pause of the most intense quietness, in which there was not even the hum of talk from the men alongside in the boat. We all heard it, a kind of dull, soft thud, 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 somewhere in the hull under us, yet so vague as to make me half doubtful I heard it, only that the others did so too. Captain Gannington turned suddenly to where the man stood. "Tell them," he began, but the fellow cried out something and pointed. There had come a strange intensity into his somewhat unemotional face, so that the captain's glance followed his action instantly. I stared also, as you may think. It was the great mound at which the man was pointing. I saw what he meant. From the two gapes made in the mould-like stuff by Captain Gannington's boot, the purple fluid was jetting out in a queerly regular fashion, almost as if it were being forced out by a pump. My word! But I stared, and even as I stared, a larger jet squirted out and splashed as far as the man, spattering his boots and trouser legs. The fellow had been pretty nervous before, in a stolid, ignorant sort of way, and his funk had been growing steadily, but at this he simply let out a yell and turned about to run. He paused an instant, as if a sudden fear of the darkness that held the decks, between him and the boat, had taken him. He snatched at the second mate's lantern, tore it out of his hand, and plunged heavily away over the vile stretch of mould. Mr. Selvin, the second mate, said not a word. He was just staring at the strange-smelling twin streams of dull purple that were jetting out from the wobbling mound. Captain Gannington, however, roared an order to the man to come back, but the man plunged on and on across the mould, his feet seeming to be clogged by the stuff, as if it had grown suddenly soft. He zigzagged as he ran, the lantern swaying in wild circles as he wrenched his feet free with a constant plop, plop, and I could hear his frightened gasps even from where I stood. "Come back with that lamp," roared the captain again, but still the man took no notice. And Captain Gannington was silent an instant, his lips working in a queer, inarticulate fashion, as if he were stunned momentarily by the very violence of his anger at the man's insubordination. And in the silence I heard the sounds again, thud, 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 thud. Quite distinctly now, beating, it seemed suddenly to me, right down under my feet, but deep. I stared down at the mould on which I was standing, with a quick, disgusting sense of the terrible all about me. Then I looked at the captain, and tried to say something, without appearing frightened. I saw that he had turned again to the mound, and all the anger had gone out of his face. He had his lamp out towards the mound, and was listening. There was another moment of absolute silence, at least. I knew that I was not conscious of any sound at all in all the world, except that extraordinary thud, 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 down somewhere in the huge bulk under us. The captain shifted his feet with a sudden, nervous movement, and as he lifted them, the mould went plop, plop. He looked quickly at me, trying to smile, as if he were not thinking anything very much about it. "What do you make of it, Doctor?" he said. "I think," I began. But the second mate interrupted with a single word, his voice pitched a little high, in a tone that made us both stare instantly at him. "Look," he said, and pointed at the mound. The thing was all of a slow quiver. A strange ripple ran outward from it, along the deck, like you will see a ripple run inshore out of a calm sea. It reached a mound a little foreside of us, which I had supposed to be the cabin skylight, and in a moment the second mound sank nearly level with the surrounding decks, quivering floppily in a most extraordinary fashion. A sudden quick tremor took the mould right under the second mate, and he gave out a hoarse little cry and held his arms out on each side of him to keep his balance. The tremor in the mould spread, and Captain Gannington swayed and spread out his feet with a sudden curse of fright. The second mate jumped across to him and caught him by the wrist. "The boat, sir," he said, saying the very thing that I had lacked the pluck to say. "For God's sake." But he never finished, for a tremendous hoarse scream cut off his words. They hove themselves round and looked. I could see without turning. The man who had run from us was standing in the waist of the ship, about a fathom from the starboard bulwarks. He was swaying from side to side and screaming in a dreadful fashion. He appeared to be trying to lift his feet, and the light from his swaying lantern showed an almost incredible sight. All about him, the mould was in active movement. His feet had sunk out of sight. The stuff appeared to be lapping at his legs, and abruptly his bare flesh showed. The hideous stuff had rent his trouser leg away as if it were paper. He gave out a simply sickening scream, and, with a vast effort, wrenched one leg free. It was partly destroyed. The next instant he pitched face downward, and the stuff heaped itself upon him, as if it were actually alive, with a dreadful, severe life. It was simply infernal. The man had gone from sight, Where he had fallen was now a writhing, elongated mound, in constant and horrible increase, as the mould appeared to move towards it in strange ripples from all sides. Captain Gannington and the second mate were stone silent, in amazed and incredulous horror, but I had begun to reach towards a grotesque and terrific conclusion, both helped and hindered by my professional training. From the men in the boat alongside, there was a loud shouting, and I saw two of their faces appear suddenly above the rail. They showed clearly a moment in the light from the lamp which the man had snatched from Mr. Selvin, for, strangely enough, this lamp was standing upright and unharmed on the deck, a little way foreside of that dreadful, elongated, growing mound that still swayed and writhed with an incredible horror. The lamp rose and fell on the passing ripples of the mould, just for all the world, as you will see a boat rise and fall on little swells. It is of some interest to me now, psychologically, to remember how that rising and falling lantern brought home to me more than anything the incomprehensible, dreadful strangeness of it all. The men's faces disappeared with sudden yells, as if they had slipped or been suddenly hurt, and there was a fresh uproar of shouting from the boat. The men were calling to us to come away. To come away. In the same instant I felt my left boot drawn suddenly and forcibly downward, with a horrible, painful grip. I wrenched it free with a yell of angry fear. Forward of us I saw that the vile surface was all a-move, and abruptly I found myself shouting in a queer, frightened voice, "The boat, Captain! The boat, Captain!" Captain Gannington stared round at me, over his right shoulder, in a peculiar dull way that told me he was utterly dazed with bewilderment and the incomprehensibleness of it all. I took a quick, clogged, nervous step towards him and gripped his arm and shook it fiercely. "The boat!" I shouted at him. "The boat! For God's sake, tell the men to bring the boat aft." Then the mound must have drawn his feet down, for abruptly he bellowed fiercely with terror, his momentary apathy giving place to furious energy. His thick-set, vastly muscular body doubled and writhed with his enormous effort, and he struck out madly, dropping the lantern. He tore his feet free, something ripping as he did so. The reality and necessity of the situation had come upon him brutishly real, and he was roaring to the men in the boat, "Bring the boat aft! Bring her aft! Bring her aft!" The second mate and I were shouting the same thing madly. "For God's sake, be smart, lads!" roared the captain, and stooped quickly for his lamp, which still burned. His feet were gripped again, and he hove them out, blaspheming breathlessly, awed, leaping a yard high with his effort. Then he made a run for the side, wrenching his feet free at each step. In the same instant, the second mate cried out something and grabbed at the captain. "It's got hold of my feet! It's got hold of my feet!" he screamed. His feet had disappeared up to his boot tops, and Captain Gannington caught him round the waist with his powerful left arm, gave a mighty heave, and the next instant had him free, but both his boot soles had gone. For my part, I jumped madly from foot to foot, to avoid the plucking of the mould, and suddenly I made a run for the ship's side. But before I could get there, a queer gape came in the mould between us and the side, at least a couple of feet wide, and how deep I don't know. It closed up in an instant, and all the mould where the cape had been vent into a sort of flurry of horrible ripplings, so that I ran back from it, for I did not dare to put my foot upon it. Then the captain was shouting to me, "Aft, doctor! Aft, doctor! This way, doctor! Run!" I saw then that he had passed me, and was up on the after-raised portion of the poop. He had the second mate, thrown like a sack, all loose and quiet, over his left shoulder, for Mr. Selvin had fainted, and his long legs flogged limp and helpless against the captain's massive knees as he ran. I saw, with a queer, unconscious noting of minor details, how the torn soles of the second mate's boots flapped and jigged as the captain staggered aft. "Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy! Boat ahoy!" shouted the captain, and then I was beside him, shouting also. The men were answering with loud yells of encouragement, and it was plain they were working desperately to force the boat aft through the thick scum about the ship. We reached the ancient, mould-hid taffrail and slewed about breathlessly in the half-darkness to see what was happening. Captain Gannington had left his lantern by the big mound when he picked up the second mate, and as we stood, gasping, we discovered suddenly that all the mould between us and the light was full of movement. Yet the part on which we stood, for about 6 or 8 feet forward of us, was still firm. Every couple of seconds we shouted to the men to hasten, and they kept on calling to us that they would be with us in an instant. And all the time we watched the deck of that dreadful hulk, feeling, for my part, literally sick with mad suspense, and ready to jump overboard into that filthy scum all about us. Down somewhere in the huge bulk of the ship, there was all the time that extraordinary dull, ponderous thud, thud growing ever louder. I seemed to feel the whole hull of the derelict beginning to quiver and thrill with each dull beat. And to me, with the grotesque and hideous suspicion of what made that noise, it was at once the most dreadful and incredible sound I have ever heard. As we waited desperately for the boat, I scanned incessantly so much of the grey-white bulk as the lamp showed. The whole of the deck seemed to be in strange movement. Forward of the lamp, I could see indistinctly the moundings of the mould swaying and nodding hideously beyond the circle of the brightest rays. Nearer, and full in the glow of the lamp, the mound which should have indicated the skylight was swelling steadily. There were ugly purple veinings on it, and as it swelled, it seemed to me that the veinings and mottlings on it were becoming plainer, rising as though embossed upon it, like you will see the veins stand out on the body of a powerful, full-blooded horse. It was most extraordinary. The mound that we had supposed to cover the companionway had sunk flat with the surrounding mould, and I could not see that it jetted out any more of the purplish fluid. A quaking movement of the mound began away forward of the lamp, and came flurrying away aft towards us, and at the sight of that I climbed up onto the spongy-feeling taffrail and yelled afresh for the boat. The men answered with a shout, which told me they were nearer, but the beastly scum was so thick that it was evidently a fight to move the boat at all. Beside me, Captain Gannington was shaking the second mate furiously, and the man stirred and began to moan. The captain shook him again. wake up, mister," he shouted. The second mate staggered out of the captain's arms and collapsed suddenly, shrieking, "My feet! Oh God, my feet!" The captain and I lugged him off the mound and got him into a sitting position upon the taffrail, where he kept up a continual moaning. "Hold him, doctor," said the captain, and whilst I did so, he ran forward a few yards and peered down over the starboard quarter rail. "For God's sake, be smart, lads! Be smart! Be smart!" he shouted down to the men, and they answered him, breathless from close at hand, yet still too far away for the boat to be any use to us on the instant. I was holding the moaning, half-unconscious officer and staring forward along the poop decks. The flurrying of the mould was coming aft, slowly and noiselessly. And then suddenly, I saw something closer. "Look out, Captain!" I shouted. And even as I shouted, the mould near to him gave a sudden, peculiar slobber. I had seen a ripple stealing towards him through the mould. He gave an enormous, clumsy leap and landed near to us on the sound part of the mould, but the movement followed him. He turned and faced it, swearing fiercely. All about his feet there came abruptly little gapings, which made horrid sucking noises. "Come back, Captain," I yelled. "Come back, quick!" As I shouted, a ripple came at his feet, lipping at them, and he stamped insanely at it and leaped back, his boot torn half off his foot. He swore madly with pain and anger, and jumped swiftly for the taffrail. "Come on, doctor, over we go," he called. Then he remembered the filthy scum, and hesitated, and roared out desperately to the men to hurry. I stared down also. "The second mate," I said. "I'll take charge, doctor," said Captain Gannington, and caught hold of Mr. Selvin. As he spoke, I thought I saw something beneath us, outlined against the scum. I leaned out over the stern and peered. There was something under the port quarter. "There's something down there, Captain," I called and pointed in the darkness. He stooped far over and stared. "A boat, by gum! A boat!" he yelled, and began to wriggle swiftly along the taffrail, dragging the second mate after him. I followed. "A boat it is, sure," he exclaimed a few moments later, and picking up the second mate clear of the rail, he hove him down into the boat, where he fell with a crash into the bottom. "Over ye go, Doctor," he yelled at me, and pulled me bodily off the rail and dropped me after the officer. As he did so, I felt the whole of the ancient spongy rail give a peculiar sickening quiver and begin to wobble. I fell onto the second mate, and the captain came after, almost in the same instant, but fortunately he landed clear of us, onto the forethwart, which broke under his weight, with a loud crack and splintering of wood. "Thank God," I heard him mutter. "Thank God. I guess that was a mighty near thing to going to Hades." He struck a match just as I got to my feet, and between us we got the second mate straightened out on one of the after fore and aft thwarts. We shouted to the men in the boat, telling them where we were, and saw the light of their lantern shining round the starboard counter of the derelict. They called back to us to tell us they were doing their best, and then, whilst we waited, Captain Gannington struck another match and began to overhaul the boat we had dropped into. She was a modern two-bowed boat, and on the stern there was painted Cyclone Glasgow. She was in pretty fair condition, and had evidently drifted into the scum and been held by it. Captain Gannington struck several matches and went forward towards the derelict. Suddenly he called to me, and I jumped over the thwarts to him. "Look, Doctor," he said, and I saw what he meant, a mass of bones up in the bows of the boat. I stooped over them and looked. There were the bones of at least 3 people, all mixed together in an extraordinary fashion, and quite clean and dry. I had a sudden thought concerning the bones, but I said nothing, for my thought was vague in some ways, and concerned the grotesque and incredible suggestion that had come to me as to the cause of that ponderous, dull thud. Thud, 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 that beat on so infernally within the hull, and was plain to hear even now that we had got off the vessel herself. And all the while, I had a sick, horrible mental picture of that frightful wriggling mound aboard the hulk. As Captain Gannington struck a final match, I saw something that sickened me, and the captain saw it in the same instant. The match went out, and he fumbled clumsily for another, and struck it. We saw the thing again. We had not been mistaken. A great lip of grey-white was protruding in over the edge of the boat. A great lappet of the mould was coming stealthily towards us, a live mass of the very hull itself. And suddenly Captain Gannington yelled out in so many words the grotesque and incredible thing I was thinking, "She's alive!" I never heard such a sound of comprehension and terror in a man's voice. The very horrified assurance of it made actual to me the thing that before had only lurked in my subconscious mind. I knew he was right. I knew that the explanation my reason and my training both repelled and reached towards was the true one. Oh, I wonder whether anyone can possibly understand our feelings in that moment. The unmitigated horror of it, and the incredibleness. As the light of the match burned up fully, I saw that the mass of living matter coming towards us was streaked and veined with purple, the veins standing out enormously distended. The whole thing quivered continuously to each ponderous thud, 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 thud of that gargantuan organ that pulsed within the huge grey-white bulk. The flame of the match reached the captain's fingers, and there came to me a little sickly whiff of burned flesh, but he seemed unconscious of any pain. Then the flame went out in a brief sizzle, yet at the last moment I had seen an extraordinary raw look become visible upon the end of that monstrous protruding lappet. It had become dewed with a hideous purplish sweat, and with the darkness there came a sudden charnel-like stench. I heard the matchbox split in Captain Gannington's hands as he wrenched it open. Then he swore in a queer, frightened voice, for he had come to the end of his matches. He turned clumsily in the darkness and tumbled over the nearest thwart in his eagerness to get to the stern of the boat, and I after him. For we knew that thing was coming towards us through the darkness, reaching over that piteous mingled heap of human bones all jumbled together in the bows. We shouted madly to the men, and for answer saw the bows of the boat emerge dimly into view round the starboard counter of the derelict. "Thank God!" I gasped out, but Captain Gannington roared to them to show a light. Yet this they could not do, for the lamp had just been stepped on in their desperate efforts to force the boat round to us. "Quick! Quick!" I shouted. "For God's sake, be smart, men!" roared the captain, and both of us faced the darkness under the port counter, out of which we knew but could not see the thing was coming to us. "An oar! Smart, now pass me an oar!" shouted the captain, and reached out his hands through the gloom towards the oncoming boat. I saw a figure stand up in the bows and hold something out to us across the intervening yards of scum. Captain Gannington swept his hands through the darkness and encountered it. "I've got it. Let go there," he said in a quick, tense voice. In the same instant, the boat we were in was pressed over suddenly to starboard by some tremendous weight. Then I heard the captain shout, "Duck your head, doctor!" And directly afterwards he swung the heavy 14-foot oar round his head and struck into the darkness. There came a sudden squelch, and he struck again, with a savage grunt of fierce energy. At the second blow, the boat righted with a slow movement, and directly afterwards the other boat bumped gently into ours. Captain Gannington dropped the oar, and springing across to the second mate, hove him up off the thwart, and pitched him with knee and arms clear in over the bows among the men. Then he shouted to me to follow, which I did, and he came after me, bringing the oar with him. We carried the second mate aft, and the captain shouted to the men to back the boat a little. Then they got her bows clear of the boat we had just left, and so headed out through the scum for the open sea. "Where's Tom Harrison?" gasped one of the men in the midst of his exertions. He happened to be Tom Harrison's particular chum, and Captain Gannington answered him briefly enough, "Dead. Pull. Don't talk." Now, difficult as it had been to force the boat through the scum to our rescue, the difficulty to get clear seemed tenfold. After some 5 minutes pulling, the boat seemed hardly to have moved a fathom, if so much, and a quite dreadful fear took me afresh, which one of the panting men put suddenly into words. "It's got us," he gasped out. "Same as poor Tom." It was the man who had inquired where Harrison was. "Shut your mouth and pull," roared the captain, and so another few minutes passed. Abruptly, it seemed to me that the dull, ponderous thud, 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 thud came more plainly through the dark, and I stared intently over the stern. I sickened a little, for I could almost swear that the dark mass of the monster was actually nearer, that it was coming nearer to us through the darkness. Captain Gannington must have had the same thought, for, after a brief look into the darkness, he jumped forward and began to double-bank the stroke oar. "Get forward under the oars, Doctor," he said to me rather breathlessly. "Get in the bows and see if you can't free the stuff a bit round the bows." I did as he told me, and a minute later I was in the bows of the boat, puddling the scum from side to side and trying to break up the viscid, clinging muck. A heavy, almost animal-like smell rose off it, and all the air seemed full of the deadening, heavy smell. I shall never find words to tell anyone on earth the whole horror of it all, the threat that seemed to hang in the very air around us, and but a little astern that incredible thing, coming, as I firmly believed, nearer, and scum holding us like half-melted glue. The minutes passed in a deadly eternal fashion, and I kept staring back astern into the darkness, but never ceasing to puddle that filthy scum, striking at it and switching it from side to side until I sweated. Abruptly, Captain Gannington sang out, "We're gaining, lads, pull!" And I felt the boat forge ahead perceptibly as they gave way with renewed hope and energy. There was soon no doubt of it, for presently that hideous thud, 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 thud had grown quite dim and vague somewhere astern, and I could no longer see the derelict. For the night had come down tremendously dark, and all the sky was thick, overset with heavy clouds. As we drew nearer and nearer to the edge of the scum, the boat moved more and more perceptibly, until suddenly we emerged with a clean, sweet, fresh sound into the open sea. "Thank God," I said aloud, and drew in the boat hook, and made my way aft again to where Captain Gannington now sat once more at the tiller. I saw him looking anxiously up at the sky and across to where the lights of our vessel burned, and again he would seem to listen intently, so that I found myself listening also. "What's that, Captain?" I said sharply, for it seemed to me that I heard a sound far astern, something between a queer whine and a low whistling. "What's that?" "It's wind, Doctor," he said in a low voice. I wished to God we were aboard. Then to the men, "Pull! Put your backs into it, or you'll never put your teeth through good bread again." The men obeyed nobly, and we reached the vessel safely and had the boat safely stowed before the storm came, which it did in a furious white smother out of the west. I could see it for some minutes beforehand, tearing the sea in the gloom into a wall of phosphorescent foam, and as it came nearer, that peculiar whining, piping sound grew louder and louder, until it was like a vast steam whistle rushing towards us. And when it did come, we got it very heavy indeed, so that the morning showed us nothing but a welter of white seas, with that grim derelict many a score of miles away in the smother, lost as utterly as our hearts could wish to lose her. When I came to examine the second mate's feet, I found them in a very extraordinary condition. The soles of them had the appearance of having been partly digested. I know of no other word that so exactly describes their condition, and the agony the man suffered must have been dreadful. "Now," concluded the doctor, "that is what I call a case in point. If we could know exactly what the old vessel had originally been loaded with, and the juxtaposition of the various articles of her cargo, plus the heat and time she had endured, plus one or two other only guessable quantities, we should have solved the chemistry of the life force, gentlemen. Not necessarily the origin, mind you, but at least we should have taken a big step on the way. I've often regretted that gale, you know, in a way. That is, in a way. It was a most amazing discovery, but at the same time, I had nothing but thankfulness to be rid of it. A most amazing chance. I often think of the way the monster woke out of its torpor. And that scum, the dead pigs caught in eye. I fancy that was a grim kind of a net, gentlemen. It caught many things. It, the old doctor sighed and nodded. If I could have had her bill of lading, he said, his eyes full of regret. If it might have told me something to help. But anyway, he began to fill his pipe again. I suppose, he ended, looking round at us gravely, I suppose we humans are an ungrateful lot of beggars at the best. But what a chance. What a chance, eh? End of The Derelict by William Hope Hodgson. The Mystery of the Derelict by William Hope Hodgson. The Storyteller, July 1907. All the night had the four-masted ship, Tarawak, lain motionless in the drift of the Gulf Stream, for she had run into a calm patch, into a stark calm which had lasted now for 2 days and nights. On every side, had it been light, might have been seen dense masses of floating Gulf weed, studding the ocean even to the distant horizon. In places so large were the weed masses that they formed long, low banks, that by daylight might have been mistaken for low-lying land. Upon the lee side of the poop, Duthie, one of the prentices, leaned with his elbows upon the rail and stared out across the hidden sea, to where in the eastern horizon showed the first pink and lemon streamers of the dawn, faint, delicate streaks and washes of colour. A period of time passed, and the surface of the leeward sea began to show, a great expanse of grey, touched with odd, wavering belts of silver, and everywhere the black specks and islets of the weed. Presently the red dome of the sun protruded itself into sight above the dark rim of the horizon, and abruptly the watching Duthie saw something, a great, shapeless bulk that lay some miles away to starboard, and showed black and distinct against the gloomy red mass of the rising sun. "Something in sight to board, sir," he informed the mate, who was leaning, smoking over the rail that ran across the break of the poop. "I can't just make out what it is." The mate rose from his easy position, stretched himself, yawned, and came across to the boy. "Whereabouts, Toby?" he asked, wearily and yawning again. "There, sir," said Duthie, alias Toby, "broad away on the beam and right in the track of the sun. It looks something like a big houseboat or a haystack." The mate stared in the direction indicated and saw the thing which puzzled the boy, and immediately the tiredness went out of his eyes and face. "Pass me the glasses off the skylight, Toby," he commanded, and the youth obeyed. After the mate had examined the strange object through his binoculars for, maybe, a minute, he passed them to Toby, telling him to take a squint and say what he made of it. "Looks like an old powder hulk, sir," exclaimed the lad after a while, and to this description the mate nodded agreement. Later, when the sun had risen somewhat, they were able to study the derelict with more exactness. She appeared to be a vessel of an exceedingly old type, mastless, and upon the hull of which had been built a roof-like superstructure, the use of which they could not determine. She was lying just within the borders of one of the weed banks, and all her side was splotched with a greenish growth. It was her position within the borders of the weed that suggested to the puzzled mate how so strange and unseaworthy-looking a craft had come so far abroad into the greatness of the ocean. For suddenly it occurred to him that she was neither more nor less than a derelict from the vast Sargasso Sea, a vessel that had possibly been lost to the world, scores and scores of years gone, perhaps hundreds. The suggestion touched the mate's thoughts with solemnity, and he fell to examining the ancient hulk with an even greater interest, and pondering on all the lonesome and awful years that must have passed over her as she had lain desolate and forgotten in that grim cemetery of the ocean. Through all that day, the derelict was an object of the most intense interest to those aboard the Tarawak, every glass in the ship being brought into use to examine her. Yet, though within no more than some 6 or 7 miles of her, the captain refused to listen to the mate's suggestions that they should put a boat into the water and pay the stranger a visit. For he was a cautious man, and the glass warned him that a sudden change might be expected in the weather, so that he would have no one leave the ship on any unnecessary business. But for all that he had caution, curiosity was by no means lacking in him, and his telescope, at intervals, was turned on the ancient hulk through all the day. Then it would be about 6 bells in the second dog watch. A sail was sighted astern, coming up steadily but slowly. By 8 bells, they were able to make out that a small bark was bringing the wind with her. Her yards were squared and every stitch set, yet the night had advanced apace, and it was nigh to 11 o'clock before the wind reached those aboard the Tarawak. When at last it arrived, there was a slight rustling and quaking of canvas and odd creaks here and there in the darkness amid the gear, as each portion of the running and standing rigging took up the strain. Beneath the bows and alongside, there came gentle rippling noises as the vessel gathered way, and so, for the better part of the next hour, they slid through the water at something less than a couple of knots in the 60 minutes. To starboard of them, they could see the red light of the little bark, which had brought up the wind with her, and was now forging slowly ahead, being better able evidently than the big, heavy Tarawak to take advantage of so slight a breeze. About 11:45, just after the relieving watch had been roused, lights were observed to be moving to and fro upon the small bark, and by midnight it was palpable that, through some cause or other, she was dropping astern. When the mate arrived on deck to relieve the second, the latter officer informed him of the possibility that something unusual had occurred aboard the bark, telling of the lights about her decks, and how that, in the last quarter of an hour, she had begun to drop astern. On hearing the second mate's account, the first sent one of the prentices for his night glasses, and when they were brought, studied the other vessel intently, that is, so well as he was able through the darkness. For even through the night glasses, she showed only as a vague shape, surmounted by the 3 dim towers of her masts and sails. Suddenly the mate gave out a sharp exclamation, for, beyond the bark, there was something else shown dimly in the field of vision. He studied it with great intentness, ignoring for the instant the second's queries as to what it was that had caused him to exclaim. All at once he said, with a little note of excitement in his voice, "The derelict! The bark's run into the weed around that old hooker." The second mate gave a mutter of surprised assent and slapped the rail. "That's it," he said. "That's why we're passing her. And that explains the lights. If they're not fast in the weed, they've probably run slap into the blessed derelict. One thing," said the mate, lowering his glasses and beginning to fumble for his pipe, "she won't have had enough way on her to do much damage." The second mate, who was still peering through his binoculars, murmured an absent agreement and continued to peer. The mate, for his part, filled and lit his pipe, remarking meanwhile to the unhearing second that the light breeze was dropping. Abruptly the second mate called his superior's attention, and in the same instant, so it seemed, the failing wind died entirely away, the sails settling down into runkles, with little rustles and flutters of sagging canvas. "What's up?" asked the mate, and raised his glasses. "There's something queer going on over yonder," said the second. "Look at the lights moving about, and did you see that?" The last portion of his remark came out swiftly, with a sharp accentuation of the last word. "What?" asked the mate, staring hard. "They're shooting," replied the second. "Look, there again." "Rubbish," said the mate, a mixture of unbelief and doubt in his voice. With the falling of the wind, there had come a great silence upon the sea, and abruptly, from far across the water, sounded the distant, dullish thud of a gun, followed almost instantly by several minute, but sharply defined, reports, like the cracking of a whip out in the darkness. "Jove!" cried the mate. "I believe you're right." He paused and stared. "There," he said. "I saw the flashes then. They're firing from the poop, I believe. I must call the old man." He turned and ran hastily down into the saloon, knocked on the door of the captain's cabin, and entered. He turned up the lamp, and shaking his superior into wakefulness, told him of the thing he believed to be happening aboard the bark. "It's mutiny, sir. They're shooting from the poop." "We ought to do something." The mate said many things breathlessly, for he was a young man, but the captain stopped him with a quietly lifted hand. "I'll be up with you in a minute, Mr. Johnson," he said, and the mate took the hint and ran up on deck. Before the minute had passed, the skipper was on the poop and staring through his night glasses at the bark and the derelict. Yet now, aboard of the bark, the lights had vanished, and there showed no more the flashes of discharging weapons. Only there remained the dull, steady red glow of the port sidelight, and behind it, the night glasses showed the shadowy outline of the vessel. The captain put questions to the mates, asking for further details. "It all stopped while the mate was calling you, sir," explained the second. "We could hear the shots quite plainly." "They seem to be using a gun as well as their revolvers," interjected the mate, without ceasing to stare into the darkness. For a while the 3 of them continued to discuss the matter, whilst down on the main deck the 2 watches clustered along the starboard rail, and a low hum of talk rose fore and aft. Presently, the captain and the mates came to a decision. If there had been a mutiny, it had been brought to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion might be, and no interference from those aboard the Tarawak at that period would be likely to do good. They were utterly in the dark, in more ways than one, and for all they knew, there might not even have been any mutiny. If there had been a mutiny, and the mutineers had won, then they had done their worst, whilst if the officers had won, well and good. They had managed to do so without help. Of course, if the Tarawak had been a man of war with a large crew capable of mastering any situation, it would have been a simple matter to send a powerful, armed boat's crew to inquire, but as she was merely a merchant vessel, undermanned, as is the modern fashion, they must go warily. They would wait for the morning and signal. In a couple of hours it would be light. Then they would be guided by circumstances. The mate walked to the break of the poop and sang out to the men, "Now then, my lads, you'd better turn in below and have a sleep. We may be wanting you by 5 bells." There was a muttered chorus of, "Aye, aye, sir," and some of the men began to go forward to the forecastle, but others of the watch below remained, their curiosity overmastering their desire for sleep. On the poop, the 3 officers leaned over the starboard rail, chatting in a desultory fashion, as they waited for the dawn. At some little distance hovered Duthie, who, as eldest prentice just out of his time, had been given the post of acting third mate. Presently, the sky to starboard began to lighten with the solemn coming of the dawn. The light grew and strengthened, and the eyes of those in the Tarawak scanned with growing intentness that portion of the horizon where showed the red and dwindling glow of the bark's sidelight. Then, it was in that moment, when all the world is full of the silence of the dawn, something passed over the quiet sea, coming out of the east, a very faint, long-drawn-out, screaming, piping noise. It might almost have been the cry of a little wind wandering out of the dawn across the sea, a ghostly piping skirl, so attenuated and elusive was it. But there was in it a weird, almost threatening note that told the 3 on the poop it was no wind that made so dire and inhuman a sound. The noise ceased, dying out in an indefinite, mosquito-like shrilling, far and vague and minutely shrill, and so came the silence again. "I heard that last night when they were shooting," said the second mate, speaking very slowly and looking first at the skipper and then at the mate. "It was when you were below calling the captain," he added. "Shh," said the mate, and held up a warning hand, but though they listened, there came no further sound, and so they fell to disjointed questionings, and guessed their answers, as puzzled men will. And ever and anon, they examined the bark through their glasses, but without discovering anything of note, save that, when the light grew stronger, they perceived that her jibboom had struck through the superstructure of the derelict, tearing a considerable gap therein. Presently, when the day had sufficiently advanced, the mate sung out to the third to take a couple of the prentices and pass up the signal flags and the code book. This was done and a hoist made, but those in the bark took not the slightest heed, so that finally the captain bade them make up the flags and return them to the locker. After that, he went down to consult the glass, and when he reappeared, he and the mates had a short discussion, after which orders were given to hoist out the starboard lifeboat. This, in the course of half an hour, they managed, and after that, 6 of the men and 2 of the prentices were ordered into her. Then, 6 rifles were passed down, with ammunition, and the same number of cutlasses. These were all apportioned among the men, much to the disgust of the 2 apprentices, who were aggrieved that they should be passed over. But their feelings altered when the mate descended into the boat and handed them each a loaded revolver, warning them, however, to play no monkey tricks with the weapons. Just as the boat was about to push off, Duthie, the eldest prentice, came scrambling down the side ladder and jumped for the after thwart. He landed and sat down, laying the rifle which he had brought in the stern, and after that the boat put off for the bark. There were now 10 in the boat, and all well armed, so that the mate had a certain feeling of comfort that he would be able to meet any situation that was likely to arise. After nearly an hour's hard pulling, the heavy boat had been brought within some 200 yards of the bark, and the mate sung out to the men to lie on their oars for a minute. Then he stood up and shouted to the people on the bark, but though he repeated his cry of "Ship ahoy!" several times, there came no reply. He sat down and motioned to the men to give way again, and so brought the boat nearer the bark by another 100 yards. Here he hailed again, but still receiving no reply, he stooped for his binoculars and peered for a while through them at the two vessels, the ancient derelict and the modern sailing vessel. The latter had driven clean in over the weed, her stern being perhaps some 20 yards from the edge of the bank. Her jibboom, as I have already mentioned, had pierced the green-blotched superstructure of the derelict, so that her cutwater had come very close to the grass-grown side of the hulk. That the derelict was indeed a very ancient vessel, it was now easy to see, for at this distance the mate could distinguish which was hull and which superstructure. Her stern rose up to a height considerably above her bows, and possessed galleries coming round the counter. In the window frames, some of the glass still remained, but others were securely shuttered, and some missing, frames and all, leaving dark holes in the stern. And everywhere grew the dank, green growth, giving to the beholder a queer sense of repulsion. Indeed, there was that about the whole of the ancient craft that repelled in a curious way, something elusive, a remoteness from humanity that was vaguely abominable. The mate put down his binoculars and drew his revolver, and, at the action, each one in the boat gave an instinctive glance to his own weapon. Then he sang out to them to give way and steered straight for the weed. The boat struck it, with something of a sog, and after that they advanced slowly, yard by yard, only with considerable labor. They reached the counter of the bark, and the mate held out his hand for an oar. This he leaned up against the side of the vessel, and a moment later was swarming quickly up it. He grasped the rail and swung himself aboard, then, after a swift glance fore and aft, gripped the blade of the oar to steady it, and bade the rest follow as quickly as possible, which they did. The last man bringing up the painter with him, and making it fast to a cleat. Then commenced a rapid search through the ship. In several places about the main deck they found broken lamps, and aft on the poop a shotgun, 3 revolvers, and several capstan bars lying about the poop deck. But though they pried into every possible corner, lifting the hatches and examining the lazarette, not a human creature was to be found. The bark was absolutely deserted. After the first rapid search, the mate called his men together, for there was an uncomfortable sense of danger in the air, and he felt that it would be better not to straggle. Then he led the way forward, and went up on to the topgallant forecastle head. Here, finding the port sidelights still burning, he bent over the screen, lifted the lamp, opened it, and blew out the flame, then replaced the affair on its socket. After that he climbed into the bows, and out along the jibboom, beckoning to the others to follow, which they did, no man saying a word, and all holding their weapons handily, for each felt the oppressiveness of the incomprehensible about them. The mate reached the hole in the great superstructure and passed inside, the rest following. Here they found themselves in what looked something like a great gloomy barracks, the floor of which was the deck of the ancient craft. The superstructure, as seen from the inside, was a very wonderful piece of work, being beautifully shored and fixed, so that at one time it must have possessed immense strength, though now it was all rotted, and showed many a gape and rip. In one place, near the centre or midships part, was a sort of platform, high up, which the mate conjectured might have been used as a lookout, though the reason for the prodigious superstructure itself he could not imagine. Having searched the decks of this craft, he was preparing to go below, when suddenly Duthie caught him by the sleeve, and whispered to him tensely to listen. He did so, and heard the thing that had attracted the attention of the youth. It was a low, continuous, shrill whining that was rising from out of the dark hull beneath their feet, and, abruptly, The mate grew aware of an intensely disagreeable animal-like smell in the air. He had noticed it, in a subconscious fashion, when entering through the broken superstructure, but now, suddenly, he was aware of it. Then, as he stood there hesitating, the whining noise rose all at once into a piping, screaming squeal that filled all the space in which they were enclosed, with an awful, inhuman and threatening clamor. The mate turned and shouted at the top of his voice to the rest to retreat to the bark, and he himself, after a further quick, nervous glance round, hurried towards the place where the end of the bark's jibboom protruded in across the decks. He waited, with strained impatience, glancing ever behind him, until all were off the derelict, and then sprang swiftly onto the spar that was their bridge to the other vessel. Even as he did so, the squealing died away into a tiny, shrilling, twittering sound that made him glance back, for the suddenness of the quiet was as effective as though it had been a loud noise. What he saw seemed to him in that first instant so incredible and monstrous that he was almost too shaken to cry out. Then he raised his voice in a shout of warning to the men, and a frenzy of haste shook him in every fibre as he scrambled back to the bark, shouting ever to the men to get into the boat. For in that backward glance, he had seen the whole decks of the derelict move with living things, giant rats, thousands and tens of thousands of them, and so in a flash had come to an understanding of the disappearance of the crew of the bark. He had reached the forecastle head now and was running for the steps, and behind him, making all the long slanting length of the jibboom black, were the rats racing after him. He made one leap to the main deck and ran. Behind sounded a queer, multitudinous pattering noise, swiftly surging upon him. He reached the poop steps, and as he sprang up them felt a savage bite in his left calf. He was on the poop deck now, and running with a stagger. A score of great rats leapt around him, and half a dozen hung grimly to his back, whilst the one that had gripped his calf flogged madly from side to side as he raced on. He reached the rail, gripped it, and vaulted clean over and down into the weed. The rest were already in the boat, and strong hands and arms hove him aboard, whilst the others of the crew sweated in getting their little craft round from the ship. The rats still clung to the mate, but a few blows with a cutlass eased him of his murderous burden. Above them, making the rails and half round of the poop, black and alive, raced thousands of rats. The boat was now about an oar's length from the bark, and suddenly Duthie screamed out that they were coming. In the same instant, nearly 100 of the largest rats launched themselves at the boat. Most fell short into the weed, but over a score reached the boat and sprang savagely at the men, and there was a minute's hard slashing and smiting before the brutes were destroyed. Once more the men resumed their task of urging their way through the weed, and so in a minute or two had come to within some fathoms of the edge, working desperately. Then a fresh terror broke upon them. Those rats which had missed their leap were now all about the boat, leaping in from the weed, running up the oars and scrambling in over the sides. As each one got aboard, straight for one of the crew it went, so that they were all bitten and bebled in a score of places. There ensued a short but desperate fight, and then, when the last of the beasts had been hacked to death, the men lay once more to the task of heaving the boat clear of the weed. A minute passed, and they had come almost to the edge, when Duthie cried out, "Look!" And at that, all turned to stare at the bark, and perceived the thing that had caused the prentice to cry out, for the rats were leaping down into the weed in black multitudes, making the great weed fronds quiver as they hurled themselves in the direction of the boat. In an incredibly short space of time, all the weed between the boat and the bark was alive with the little monsters, coming at breakneck speed. The mate let out a shout, and snatching an oar from one of the men, leapt into the stern of the boat and commenced to thrash the weed with it, whilst the rest laboured infernally to pluck the boat forth into the open sea. Yet, despite their mad efforts and the death-dealing blows of the mate's great 14-foot oar, The black, living mass were all about the boat and scrambling aboard in scores before she was free of the weed. As the boat shot into the clear water, the mate gave out a great curse and, dropping his oar, began to pluck the brutes from his body with his bare hands, casting them into the sea. Yet, fast almost as he freed himself, others sprang upon him so that in another minute he was like to have been pulled down, for the boat was alive and swarming with the pests. But that some of the men got to work with their cutlasses and literally slashed the brutes to pieces, sometimes killing several with a single blow. And thus, in a while, the boat was freed once more, though it was a sorely wounded and frightened lot of men that manned her. The mate himself took an oar, as did all those who were able, and so they rowed slowly and painfully away from that hateful derelict, whose crew of monsters even then made the weed all of a heave with hideous life. From the Tarawak came urgent signals for them to haste, by which the mate knew that the storm, which the captain had feared, must be coming down upon the ship. And so he spurred each one to greater endeavour, until at last they were under the shadow of their own vessel, with very thankful hearts and bodies bleeding, tired and faint. Slowly and painfully the boat's crew scrambled up the side ladder, and the boat was hoisted aboard. But they had no time then to tell their tale, for the storm was almost upon them. It came half an hour later, sweeping down in a cloud of white fury from the eastward, and blotting out all vestiges of the mysterious derelict and the little bark which had proved her victim. And after that, for a weary day and night, they battled with the storm. When it passed, nothing was to be seen, either of the two vessels, or of the weed which had studded the sea before the storm, for they had been blown many a score of leagues to the westward of the spot, and so had no further chance, nor, I believe, inclination, to investigate further the mystery of that strange old derelict of a past time, and her habitants of rats. Yet many a time, and in many forecastlets has this story been told, and many a conjecture has been passed as to how came that ancient craft abroad there in the ocean. Some have suggested, as indeed I have made bold to put forth as fact, that she must have drifted out of the lonesome Sargasso Sea. And, in truth, I cannot but think this the most reasonable supposition. Yet, of the rats that evidently dwelt in her, I have no reasonable explanation to offer. Whether they were true ship's rats, or a species that is to be found in the weed-haunted plains and islets of the Sargasso Sea, I cannot say. It may be that they are the descendants of rats that lived in ships long centuries lost in the weed sea, and which have learned to live among the weed, forming new characteristics and developing fresh powers and instincts. Yet I cannot say, for I speak entirely without authority, and do but tell this story as it is told in the forecastle of many an old-time sailing ship. That dark, brine-tainted place where the young men learn somewhat of the mysteries of the all-mysterious sea. End of The Mystery of the Derelict by William Hope Hodgson. The Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson. The Blue Book Magazine, November 1907. It was a dark, starless night. We were becalmed in the northern Pacific. Our exact position I do not know, for the sun had been hidden during the course of a weary, breathless week by a thin haze which had seemed to float above us about the height of our mastheads, at whiles descending and shrouding the surrounding sea. With there being no wind, we had steadied the tiller, and I was the only man on deck. The crew, consisting of 2 men and a boy, was sleeping forward in their den, while Will, my friend, and the master of our little craft, was aft in his bunk on the port side of the little cabin. Suddenly, from out of the surrounding darkness, there came a hail, "Schooner, ahoy!" The cry was so unexpected that I gave no immediate answer because of my surprise. It came again, a voice curiously throaty and inhuman, calling from somewhere upon the dark sea away on our port broadside, "Schooner, ahoy!" "Hullo," I sung out, having gathered my wits somewhat. "What are you? What do you want?" "You need not be afraid," answered the queer voice, having probably noticed some trace of confusion in my tone. "I am only an old man." The pause sounded oddly, but it was only afterwards that it came back to me with any significance. "Why don't you come alongside then?" I queried somewhat snappishly, for I liked not his hinting at my having been a trifle shaken. I can't. It wouldn't be safe. The voice broke off, and there was silence. "What do you mean?" I asked, growing more and more astonished. "Why not safe? Where are you?" I listened for a moment, but there came no answer, and then, a sudden indefinite suspicion of I knew not what coming to me, I stepped swiftly to the binnacle and took out the lighted lamp. At the same time, I knocked on the deck with my heel to waken Will. Then I was back at the side, throwing the yellow funnel of light out into the silent immensity beyond our rail. As I did so, I heard a slight muffled cry, and then the sound of a splash as though someone had dipped oars abruptly. Yet I cannot say that I saw anything with certainty, save it seemed to me that with the first flash of the light there had been something upon the waters, where now there was nothing. "Hello there," I called. "What foolery is this?" But there came only the indistinct sounds of a boat being pulled away into the night. Then I heard Will's voice from the direction of the after scuttle. "What's up, George?" "Come here, Will," I said. "What is it?" he asked, coming across the deck. I told him the queer thing which had happened. He put several questions. Then, after a moment's silence, he raised his hands to his lips and hailed, "Boat, ahoy!" From a long distance away there came back to us a faint reply, and my companion repeated his call. Presently, after a short period of silence, there grew on our hearing the muffled sound of oars, at which Will hailed again. This time there was a reply, "Put away the light." "I'm damned if I will," I muttered, but Will told me to do as the voice bade, and I shoved it down under the bulwarks. "Come nearer," he said, and the oar strokes continued. Then, when apparently some half-dozen fathoms distant, they again ceased. "Come alongside," exclaimed Will. "There's nothing to be frightened of aboard here. Promise that you will not show the light." "What's to do with you?" I burst out, "that you're so infernally afraid of the light?" "Because," began the voice, and stopped short. "Because what?" I asked quickly. Will put his hand on my shoulder. "Shut up a minute, old man," he said in a low voice. "Let me tackle him." He leant more over the rail. "See here, mister," he said. "This is a pretty queer business, you coming upon us like this, right out in the middle of the blessed Pacific. How are we to know what sort of a hanky-panky trick you're up to? You say there's only one of you. How are we to know, unless we get a squint at you, eh? What's your objection to the light, anyway?" As he finished, I heard the noise of the oars again, and then the voice came, but now from a greater distance, and sounding extremely hopeless and pathetic. "I am sorry. I would not have troubled you, only I am hungry, and so is she." The voice died away, and the sound of the oars dipping irregularly was borne to us. "Stop," sung out Will. "I don't want to drive you away. Come back. We'll keep the light hidden if you don't like it." He turned to me. "It's a damned queer rig, this, but I think there's nothing to be afraid of." There was a question in his tone, and I replied, "No, I think the poor devil's been wrecked around here and gone crazy." The sound of the oars drew nearer. "Shove that lamp back in the binnacle," said Will. Then he leaned over the rail and listened. I replaced the lamp and came back to his side. The dipping of the oars ceased some dozen yards distant. "Won't you come alongside now?" asked Will in an even voice. "I have had the lamp put back in the binnacle." I cannot," replied the voice. "I dare not come nearer. I dare not even pay you for the provisions." "That's all right," said Will, and hesitated. You're welcome to as much grub as you can take. Again he hesitated. You are very good, exclaimed the voice. May God, who understands everything, reward you. It broke off huskily. The lady, said Will abruptly. Is she? I have left her behind upon the island, came the voice. What island? I cut in. I know not its name, returned the voice. I would to God, it began, and checked itself as suddenly. Could we not send a boat for her? Asked Will at this point. No, said the voice, with extraordinary emphasis. My God! No. There was a moment's pause, then it added, in a tone which seemed a merited reproach. It was because of our want, I ventured, because her agony tortured me. I am a forgetful brute, exclaimed Will. Just wait a minute, whoever you are, and I will bring you up something at once. In a couple of minutes he was back again, and his arms were full of various edibles. He paused at the rail. Can't you come alongside for them? He asked. No, I dare not, replied the voice, and it seemed to me that in its tones I detected a note of stifled craving, as though the owner hushed a mortal desire. It came to me then in a flash that the poor old creature out there in the darkness was suffering for actual need of that which Will held in his arms. And yet, because of some unintelligible dread, refraining from dashing to the side of our little schooner and receiving it. And with a lightning-like conviction, there came the knowledge that the invisible was not mad, but sanely facing some intolerable horror. Damn it, Will, I said, full of many feelings, over which predominated a vast sympathy. Get a box. We must float off the stuff to him in it. This we did, propelling it away from the vessel, out into the darkness, by means of a boat-hook. In a minute, a slight cry from the invisible came to us, and we knew that he had secured the box. A little later, he called out a farewell to us, and so heartful a blessing that I am sure we were the better for it. Then, without more ado, we heard the ply of oars across the darkness. Pretty soon off, remarked Will, with perhaps just a little sense of injury. Wait, I replied. I think somehow he'll come back. He must have been badly needing that food. And the lady, said Will. For a moment he was silent. Then he continued. It's the queerest thing ever I've tumbled across since I've been fishing. Yes, I said, and fell to pondering. And so the time slipped away, an hour, another, and still Will stayed with me, for the queer adventure had knocked all desire for sleep out of him. The third hour was 3 parts through, when we heard again the sound of oars across the silent ocean. Listen, said Will, a low note of excitement in his voice. He's coming, just as I thought, I muttered. The dipping of the oars grew nearer, and I noted that the strokes were firmer and longer. The food had been needed. They came to a stop a little distance off the broadside, and the queer voice came again to us through the darkness. Schooner, ahoy! That you? Asked Will. Yes, replied the voice. I left you suddenly, but there was great need. The lady? Questioned Will. The lady is grateful now on earth. She will be more grateful soon in heaven. Will began to make some reply, in a puzzled voice, but became confused and broke off short. I said nothing. I was wondering at the curious pauses, and apart from my wonder, I was full of a great sympathy. The voice continued, she and I have talked, as we share the result of God's tenderness and yours, Will interposed, but without coherence. I beg of you not to belittle your deed of Christian charity this night, said the voice. Be sure that it has not escaped his notice. It stopped, and there was a full minute's silence. Then it came again. We have spoken together upon that which has befallen us. We had thought to go out, without telling any, of the terror which has come into our lives. She is with me in believing that tonight's happenings are under a special ruling, and that it is God's wish that we should tell to you all that we have suffered since. Yes, said Will softly, since the sinking of the albatross. "Ah," I exclaimed involuntarily. "She left Newcastle for Frisco some 6 months ago, and hasn't been heard of since." "Yes," answered the voice. "But some few degrees to the north of the line she was caught in a terrible storm and dismasted. When the day came, it was found that she was leaking badly, and, presently, it falling to a calm, the sailors took to the boats, leaving a young lady, my fiancée, and myself upon the wreck. We were below, gathering together a few of our belongings, when they left. They were entirely callous, through fear, and when we came up upon the deck, we saw them only as small shapes afar off upon the horizon. Yet we did not despair, but set to work and constructed a small raft. Upon this we put such few matters as it would hold, including a quantity of water and some ship's biscuit. Then, the vessel being very deep in the water, we got ourselves onto the raft and pushed off. It was later when I observed that we seemed to be in the way of some tide or current, which bore us from the ship at an angle, so that in the course of 3 hours by my watch, her hull became invisible to our sight, her broken masts remaining in view for a somewhat longer period. Then, towards evening, it grew misty, and so through the night. The next day we were still encompassed by the mist, the weather remaining quiet. For 4 days we drifted through this strange haze until, on the evening of the 4th day, there grew upon our ears the murmur of breakers at a distance. Gradually it became plainer, and somewhat after midnight, it appeared to sound upon either hand at no very great space. The raft was raised upon a swell several times, and then we were in smooth water, and the noise of the breakers was behind. When the morning came, we found that we were in a sort of great lagoon, but of this we noticed little at the time, for close before us, through the enshrouding mist, loomed the hull of a large sailing vessel. With one accord, we fell upon our knees and thanked God, for we thought that here was an end to our perils. We had much to learn. The raft drew near to the ship, and we shouted on them to take us aboard, but none answered. Presently the raft touched against the side of the vessel, and seeing a rope hanging downwards, I seized it and began to climb. Yet I had much ado to make my way up, because of a kind of grey lichenous fungus which had seized upon the rope, and which blotched the side of the ship lividly. I reached the rail and clambered over it, onto the deck. Here I saw that the decks were covered, in great patches, with grey masses, some of them rising into nodules several feet in height. But at the time I thought less of this matter than of the possibility of there being people aboard the ship. I shouted, but none answered. Then I went to the door below the poop deck. I opened it and peered in. There was a great smell of staleness, so that I knew in a moment that nothing living was within, and with the knowledge, I shut the door quickly, for I felt suddenly lonely. I went back to the side where I had scrambled up. My sweetheart was still sitting quietly upon the raft. Seeing me look down, she called up to know whether there were any aboard of the ship. I replied that the vessel had the appearance of having been long deserted, but that if she would wait a little, I would see whether there was anything in the shape of a ladder by which she could ascend to the deck. Then we would make a search through the vessel together. A little later, on the opposite side of the decks, I found a rope-side ladder. This I carried across, and a minute afterwards she was beside me. Together we explored the cabins and apartments in the after part of the ship, but nowhere was there any sign of life. Here and there within the cabins themselves, we came across odd patches of that queer fungus, but this, as my sweetheart said, could be cleansed away. In the end, having assured ourselves that the after portion of the vessel was empty, we picked our ways to the bows, between the ugly grey nodules of that strange growth, and here we made a further search which told us that there was indeed none aboard but ourselves. This being now beyond any doubt, we returned to the stern of the ship and proceeded to make ourselves as comfortable as possible. Together we cleared out and cleaned 2 of the cabins, and after that I made examination whether there was anything eatable in the ship. This I soon found was so, and thanked God in my heart for his goodness. In addition to this, I discovered the whereabouts of the fresh water pump, and having fixed it, I found the water drinkable, though somewhat unpleasant to the taste. For several days we stayed aboard the ship without attempting to get to the shore. We were busily engaged in making the place habitable. Yet even thus early we became aware that our lot was even less to be desired than might have been imagined. For though, as a first step, we scraped away the odd patches of growth that studded the floors and walls of the cabins and saloon, yet they returned almost to their original size within the space of 24 hours, which not only discouraged us, but gave us a feeling of vague unease. Still we would not admit ourselves beaten, so set to work afresh, and not only scraped away the fungus, but soaked the places where it had been with carbolic, a can full of which I had found in the pantry. Yet, by the end of the week, the growth had returned in full strength, and, in addition, it had spread to other places, as though our touching it had allowed germs from it to travel elsewhere. On the 7th morning, my sweetheart woke to find a small patch of it growing on her pillow, close to her face. At that, she came to me, so soon as she could get her garments upon her. I was in the galley at the time, lighting the fire for breakfast. "Come here, John," she said, and led me aft. When I saw the thing upon her pillow, I shuddered, and then and there we agreed to go right out of the ship and see whether we could not fare to make ourselves more comfortable. Ashore. Hurriedly we gathered together our few belongings, and even among these I found that the fungus had been at work, for one of her shawls had a little lump of it, growing near one edge. I threw the whole thing over the side without saying anything to her. The raft was still alongside, but it was too clumsy to guide, and I lowered down a small boat that hung across the stern, and in this we made our way to the shore. Yet, as we drew near to it, I became gradually aware that here the vile fungus, which had driven us from the ship, was growing riot. In places it rose into horrible, fantastic mounds, which seemed almost to quiver, as with a quiet life, when the wind blew across them. Here and there it took on the forms of vast fingers, and in others it just spread out flat and smooth and treacherous. Odd places it appeared as grotesque stunted trees, seeming extraordinarily kinked and gnarled, the whole quaking vilely at times. At first, it seemed to us that there was no single portion of the surrounding shore which was not hidden beneath the masses of the hideous lichen. Yet, in this, I found we were mistaken. For somewhat later, coasting along the shore at a little distance, we descried a smooth white patch of what appeared to be fine sand, and there we landed. It was not sand. What it was I do not know. All that I have observed is that upon it the fungus will not grow, while everywhere else, save where the sand-like earth wanders oddly, pathwise, amid the grey desolation of the lichen, there is nothing but that loathsome greyness. It is difficult to make you understand how cheered we were to find one place that was absolutely free from the growth, and here we deposited our belongings. Then we went back to the ship for such things as it seemed to us we should need. Among other matters, I managed to bring ashore with me one of the ship's sails, with which I constructed 2 small tents which, though exceedingly rough-shaped, served the purpose for which they were intended. In these we lived and stored our various necessities, and thus for a matter of some 4 weeks all went smoothly and without particular unhappiness. Indeed, I may say with much of happiness, for we were together. It was on the thumb of her right hand that the growth first showed. It was only a small circular spot, much like a little grey mole. My God, how the fear leapt to my heart when she showed me the place. We cleansed it, between us, washing it with carbolic and water. In the morning of the following day she showed her hand to me again. The grey, warty thing had returned. For a little while we looked at one another in silence. Then, still wordless, we started again to remove it. In the midst of the operation she spoke suddenly. "What's that on the side of your face, dear?" Her voice was sharp with anxiety. I put my hand up to feel. There, under the hair by your ear, a little to the front a bit. My finger rested upon the place, and then I knew. Let us get your thumb done first, I said. And she submitted, only because she was afraid to touch me until it was cleansed. I finished washing and disinfecting her thumb, and then she turned to my face. After it was finished, we sat together and talked a while of many things, for there had come into our lives sudden, very terrible thoughts. We were, all at once, afraid of something worse than death. We spoke of loading the boat with provisions and water and making our way out onto the sea, yet we were helpless for many causes. And the growth had attacked us already. We decided to stay. God would do with us what was His will. We would wait. A month, 2 months, 3 months passed, and the places grew somewhat, and there had come others. Yet we fought so strenuously with the fear that its headway was but slow, comparatively speaking. Occasionally we ventured off to the ship for such stores as we needed. There we found that the fungus grew persistently. One of the nodules on the main deck became soon as high as my head. We had now given up all thought or hope of leaving the island. We had realized that it would be unallowable to go among healthy humans with the things from which we were suffering. With this determination and knowledge in our minds, we knew that we should have to husband our food and water, for we did not know, at that time, but that we should possibly live for many years. This reminds me that I have told you that I am an old man. Judged by the years, this is not so. But, he broke off, then continued somewhat abruptly. As I was saying, we knew that we should have to use care in the matter of food. But we had no idea then how little food there was left of which to take care. It was a week later that I made the discovery that all the other bread tanks, which I had supposed full, were empty, and that, beyond odd tins of vegetables and meat and some other matters, we had nothing on which to depend but the bread in the tank which I had already opened. After learning this, I bestirred myself to do what I could, and set to work at fishing in the lagoon, but with no success. At this I was somewhat inclined to feel desperate, until the thought came to me to try outside the lagoon, in the open sea. Here, at times, I caught odd fish, but so infrequently that they proved of but little help in keeping us from the hunger which threatened. It seemed to me that our deaths were likely to come by hunger, and not by the growth of the thing which had seized upon our bodies. We were in this state of mind when the 4th month wore out, when I made a very horrible discovery. One morning, a little before midday, I came off from the ship with a portion of the biscuits which were left. In the mouth of her tent, I saw my sweetheart sitting, eating something. "What is it, my dear?" I called out as I leapt ashore. Yet, on hearing my voice, she seemed confused, and turning, slyly threw something towards the edge of the little clearing. It fell short, and a vague suspicion having arisen within me, I walked across and picked it up. It was a piece of the grey fungus. As I went to her with it in my hand, she turned deadly pale, then rose red. I felt strangely dazed and frightened. "My dear, I said, and could say no more. Yet at words she broke down and cried bitterly. Gradually, as she calmed, I got from her the news that she had tried it the preceding day, and liked it. I got her to promise on her knees not to touch it again, however great our hunger. After she had promised, she told me that the desire for it had come suddenly, and that, until the moment of desire, she had experienced nothing towards it but the most extreme repulsion. Later in the day, feeling strangely restless and much shaken with the thing which I had discovered, I made my way along one of the twisted paths formed by the white, sand-like substance which led among the fungoid growth. I had, once before, ventured along there, but not to any great distance. This time, being involved in perplexing thought, I went much further than hitherto. Suddenly I was called to myself by a queer hoarse sound on my left. Turning quickly, I saw that there was movement among an extraordinarily shaped mass of fungus close to my elbow. It was swaying uneasily, as though it possessed life of its own. Abruptly, as I stared, the thought came to me that the thing had a grotesque resemblance to the figure of a distorted human creature. Even as the fancy flashed into my brain, there was a slight sickening noise of tearing, and I saw that one of the branch-like arms was detaching itself from the surrounding grey masses and coming towards me. The head of the thing, a shapeless grey ball, inclined in my direction. I stood stupidly, and the vile arm brushed across my face. I gave out a frightened cry and ran back a few paces. There was a sweetish taste upon my lips where the thing had touched me. I licked them and was immediately filled with an inhuman desire. I turned and seized a mass of the fungus, then more and more. I was insatiable. In the midst of devouring, the remembrance of the morning's discovery swept into my mazed brain. It was sent by God. I dashed the fragment I held to the ground. Then, utterly wretched and feeling a dreadful guiltiness, I made my way back to the little encampment. I think she knew, by some marvelous intuition which love must have given, so soon as she set eyes on me. Her quiet sympathy made it easier for me, and I told her of my sudden weakness, yet omitted to mention the extraordinary thing which had gone before. I desired to spare her all unnecessary terror, but for myself I had added an intolerable knowledge, to breed an incessant terror in my brain, for I doubted not but that I had seen the end of one of those men who had come to the island in the ship in the lagoon, and in that monstrous ending I had seen our own. Thereafter we kept from the abominable food, though the desire for it had entered into our blood. Yet our drear punishment was upon us, for day by day, with monstrous rapidity, the fungoid growth took hold of our poor bodies. Nothing we could do would check it materially, and so, we who had been human became, well, it matters less each day. Only we had been man and maid. And day by day the fight is more dreadful, to withstand the hunger lust for the terrible lichen. A week ago we ate the last of the biscuit, and since that time I have caught 3 fish. I was out here fishing tonight when your schooner drifted upon me out of the mist. I hailed you. You know the rest, and may God, out of his great heart, bless you for your goodness to a couple of poor outcast souls. There was the dip of an oar, another. Then the voice came again, and for the last time, sounding through the slight surrounding mist, ghostly and mournful. God bless you. Goodbye. Goodbye, we shouted together, hoarsely, our hearts full of many emotions. I glanced about me. I became aware that the dawn was upon us. The sun flung a stray beam across the hidden sea, pierced the mist dully, and lit up the receding boat with a gloomy fire. Indistinctly I saw something nodding between the oars. I thought of a sponge, a great grey nodding sponge. The oars continued to ply. They were grey, as was the boat, and my eyes searched a moment vainly for the conjunction of hand and oar. My gaze flashed back to the head. It nodded forward as the oars went backward for the stroke. Then the oars were dipped, the boat shot out of the patch of light, and the thing went nodding into the mist. End of The Voice in the Night by William Hope Hodgson.